just one myself, so I'm not envious of the judges, but could we have a round of applause for our team, please? Thank you so much.
That was a fabulous job of stalling if you were done.
I am done.
All right,
If
awesome.
you are ready.
Thank you.
All right.
Sorry about that, everyone. As I said, this is a new thing that we have done this semester. So with any pilot program, there are some things to figure out on the fly, including our live stream. So for those of you who I guess would have been watching at home and now cannot, I'm sorry. But now we'll go ahead and bring up the Sea Level Rise Resilience team.
The effects of a changing climate are already being felt in South Florida, which is on the front lines of one of the most potentially devastating climate impacts, sea level rise. The people who are most affected by flooding also have the least capacity to adapt to this changing world. We risk losing the vibrant neighborhoods, cultures, and people that define cities throughout Florida. Hard structures like seawalls have been a flood mitigation tool in Florida for decades. These barriers are expensive, disruptive, and inflexible, and if used alone will not be effective in meeting future challenges. Nature-based solutions like constructing wetlands, planting more trees, or restoring dunes mitigate flooding from sea level rise. Our team will expand the existing model of flood risk to evaluate the effectiveness of nature-based features, and then unite this new model with social vulnerability data sets to determine the most effective and equitable way to implement these solutions in Florida. Our project in Miami-Dade County will lay the groundwork for a distributed and integrated network of nature-based features that can reduce the impacts of flooding while boosting biodiversity, economic well-being, and social equity across the state.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the stage Sea Level Rise Resilience team led by Dr. Nazrin Alamdari from the Writers Center. Now we have about 10 minutes for questions from our panel of judges. So, judges, anyone would like to go first has a question for this team? Munir.
Explain to us what a nature-based solution is. Are you speaking of building, because the water from the sea is essentially unlimited. So where are you going to put that water to protect those communities?
Yeah, I can start. So nature-based features are features like, Mike, okay. So nature-based features are area practices like wetlands, dunes, mangroves, coastal reefs, or green infrastructure that they can be used for mitigating the impacts of flooding. Also, they have multiple co-benefits like social, economic, and biodiversity benefits. When we're talking about flooding and how they can mitigate the impacts of flooding, I'm talking about inland flooding. So they would be in inland and also in our watersheds, different watersheds that are in coastal. So anything not in the ocean, nothing in the ocean. So it's going to be inland, upstream watersheds. So we're talking about those features. Any other things that you want to add? Or?
Yeah, so we're taking a pretty... Sorry?
There's just a weird echo that's overlapping. It's hard to... I don't know if it's multiple...
Oh, AV issues? I'm sorry. I will attempt to figure that out. But you have a question for the team.
Oh, sure. You were going to say something, so go for it.
I was just going to add, we're taking a pretty broad approach to nature-based features, and they've been called different things depending on your field of research or your expertise. Natural infrastructure or green infrastructure is used interchangeably, but we'll be looking at these different features that are primarily just the natural habitats themselves, as well as green stormwater infrastructure improvements that can be used further inland to mitigate the different types of flooding we expect from sea level rise. So that will occur on the coast as well as inland areas as that sea level as water from the ocean sort of intrudes or encroaches under ground into the groundwater and then rises through the porous limestone soils that are found primarily in South Florida. So just wanted to add that.
Dr. Fulkerson, you had a question.
It looks like you are focusing on urban environments. Can you talk a little bit about how this might be expanded to non-urban coastal areas? Or maybe it isn't.
Perhaps with your model. So Nasrin can talk a little bit about the model that we plan to use, but and that might be a good first place to start. But the model that we're going to use is a USGS model that looks at flooding, and we're going to introduce manipulations of the surface to simulate different types of nature-based features. And again, we're going to test a variety of nature-based features that could be used both inland and for coastal areas. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that looks like?
So the model itself, it's called Urban Miami-Dade Model, which is called UMD. It's built for urban areas and also for nature-based features. You're mostly in urban areas, even coastals or inland. But for when you ask about like non-urban environment, so I think if there are so many models available for inland and coastal modeling. So this one is for urban, but we have agricultural watershed, we have forested watershed. So we can apply any other models for that, and we can absolutely look at other practices, not nature-based features. In agricultural watersheds, we have best management practices or agricultural BMPs, we call them. So we can look at those for sure. But this will help us to understand what are the costs and benefits of these practices, like in terms of flooding issues. And then for sure, for non-urban environment, if we use other models and if we have the environment that's more non-urban, like agriculture, forest, we can use the same strategy to look at other practices for sure, to look at the costs and benefits of them.
Thanks.
Well, if I might ask a question, tell us a little bit about why you selected Miami-Dade County for the project.
Who wants to talk about that first? I can talk about that, but maybe you know more? Or
Well, I mean, honestly, I wasn't in the beginning initial conversations where Miami came up. Okay.
yeah, okay. So I thought that maybe, yeah. So Miami-Dade County has a lot of problems, sea level rise issues, flooding issues. So one of the things that we were very interested in Miami-Dade was, so Miami-Dade does not just have the sea level rise or flooding issues, it has water quality issues as well, which we can use this work as preliminary results and then expand that work for other projects and then include water quality and pollution as well. And also we have a lot of partners there. So some of our works, especially I think my work, I have a lot of partners and collaborators. I know a lot of stakeholders. Two of my projects that already got funded was in Miami-Dade and Biscayne Bay on different matters like harmful gobblins, red tide issues. But since I built relationships with Miami-Dade County, UFI Fast Extension Services, USGS, so we have different partners. And another project that I have is again in Miami-Dade County for development of a decision support tool for planning nature-based features in different counties and different urban counties across Florida. So I think the reason that we selected that is just the issues, and also they have different relationships that they can help us for structuring our workshops and also future work in Miami-Dade County. If you want to add something. Yeah.
I'm just going to add to that using Miami-Dade County as sort of a test bed or a pilot study for expanding to other parts of Florida. While most of Florida is going to be impacted by sea level rise, if not already, many of the impacts of that are already being felt in a very real way for many people in Miami-Dade County, both coastal and inland. And there are a lot of interacting variables that kind of compound the issues associated with sea level rise induced flooding. some of which we have seen in decades past and are seeing now in terms of displacement, disproportionately impacted communities, and how the nature of those communities are beginning to shift and change, and then really starting to think ahead of that and anticipating those changes in the coming years and decades to understand how local migration might take place and how that might start to look at a larger level across the entire region and then state of Florida. These are some issues that we really need to start getting ahead of and start thinking about and planning for. And if what people want is to continue to live on the coast, then we need to begin to think about the dynamics of multiple variables and stressors and how they're going to potentially create cascading impacts for a lot of the people that are living on the front lines of changes like sea level rise. So it provides a really good test bed to then test this idea to other communities where they're likely to see, already seeing similar changes or will likely see similar changes in the coming years and decades. So.
Also, if I want to add something a little bit more, is the socioeconomic vulnerability of Miami-Dade is very high. So we went through some health studies in the Miami-Dade County, not just human health, but environmental health, the water quality issues, flooding issues, sea level rise issues. And then they created different maps of how much flooding will affect those communities. And there are so many videos. You can see that, I mean, we could bring it somewhere in the future, that they have a lot of neighborhoods and communities that they feel that if the sea level rise is going in the future, they will impact significantly, and they're worried about the price of the renting would be higher and higher. So they are very vulnerable to the sea level rise issues. And yeah, I think.
Oh, just with about 2 minutes left, Elizabeth, you have a question.
Sure. For this study, how would you define who your stakeholders are, and how do you plan to reach them? And then how do you plan to incorporate their participation in the development of your framework?
I think maybe you are more. I can talk about the partner. I think I talked about the first part. It was about the partners. So as I mentioned, I have a lot of partners.
It is so much easier to hear you without the microphone, actually. If you could just speak louder without the microphone, that would be awesome.
You step up to the front of the stage too if you want.
Okay, yeah. Here? Okay, yeah. So I was saying that, okay.
Perfect.
Their job is how to activities that they can connect us to stakeholders. And I'm already working with some of them, not like partners, but also for joint stakeholders. So I'm thinking that they are catching us now for my project. They're helping us with activities, workshops, and giving feedback to us, helping with our surveys, those kind of things. So we are going to get those help from our currently partners, and then we will leverage those existing partnerships. But you have more ideas to add?
Well, I think you mentioned a few specific groups that we have worked with in the past and built relationships with. The Southeast Regional Florida Country Compact is a voluntary group of 4 counties, including Miami-Dade. So they have a very strong innate interest in addressing these issues, and we work with some of them and through other programs, like the Word Raised Building Resilience and Climate Next program in the past. And so we would certainly reach out to those stakeholders that we are already somewhat familiar with, also the leaders, decision makers, and planners in the county and the cities themselves within the county. But then I would broaden our definition of stakeholders to include nonprofits and advocacy groups and leaders of socioeconomically vulnerable communities that we hope to bring into this effort and really benefit and work with moving forward to build this out more and use them as a partner in gathering information and feedback on how they're being impacted specifically by sea level rise and some of the changes that maybe we're seeing in some other neighborhoods in terms of gentrification and cultural and historical assets that may be threatened by flooding and sea level rise. So we hope to bring a lot of this.
And specifically actually, we have budgeted to go to that conference
Mhm.
to directly target getting more involved in person. We have several team members who have plans to go there and get involved, so we already have budget planned for that.
And I don't mean to cut you off, but that is time. Thank you so much, Sea Level Rise Resilience. We really appreciate you going first. I know that it's never easy to do, especially for a new program. You were the first ever to do this, so thank you so much. Infrastructure Resilience, you are up next.
It's been 3 years since Hurricane Michael devastated our Panhandle communities. Cities and towns still face years of rebuilding. Infrastructure decisions favor whatever can get communities back on their feet the fastest. An increasing frequency and intensity of storms make it less likely that planning and development can take place outside of a rebuilding phase.
Storms not only destroy the built environment, but also natural resources that help cycle carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases get emitted during the rebuilding process. At the same time, the region loses natural resilience.
We hope to break this cycle by encouraging resilient designs that fortify our communities against future disasters and stretch out the lifespan of infrastructure.
Our project will create a database decision and community building platform that links Panhandle infrastructure planners' teams of interdisciplinary research at FSU. We will develop decision tools that rank the replacement priority of infrastructure assets based on the value added to community, vulnerability to future disasters, and operational efficiency.
These tools will estimate the short, medium, and long-term returns on costs so that decision makers can invest in projects that shorten the cycle of asset replacement and increase returns on investments.
We will be agents for change in driving long-term proactive planning so that our Panhandle communities get to choose the world-class infrastructure that will enhance the lives of its residents for generations to come.
Please welcome to this stage, Infrastructure Resilience. Judges, would anyone like to go first? Well,
Yeah.
Munir?
Give us an example of what you do in real practical terms. You have graduate students who apply. What are you going to make those graduate students do in damaged areas like what was hit by Hurricane Michael?
Sorry, can you, cannot hear you clearly, sorry. Can you repeat your question again?
I will repeat my question. Maybe it's easier said without the microphone. Yes, okay. So give us a concrete example of the tasks that you would say your graduate students to work on if you were funded. What would you do in an area that's been hit by, say, Hurricane Michael to build resilience?
Mm-hmm. No. The people who are live streaming will only hear what's in the microphone.
Okay.
As well as our big judge, so
Okay, so now? Cool. Yeah, so basically we are trying to co-develop 3 things together in Panhandle area. So now just assuming they just got hit. So in the rebuilding process, usually it falls into a negative feedback loop. So when the hurricane hit, they rebuild all the infrastructure to withstand the stronger hurricane in the future. However, our goal is to help them also thinking about future by integrating the climate mitigation considerations. What we do is first create an analytical framework, which not only including the climate adaptation, basically stronger building codes, those kind of things. We also consider how to reduce the carbon emission of all the infrastructure. So we factored that into the analytical model. So that analytical model also considers both short-term thing and long-term mitigation to make them adapt to and also can reduce the future global warming. That's the analytical model. Secondly, we'll create the support decision support platform. So that's a technology layer. We will use the analytical framework and build them into our technologies to create this platform. It's a dashboard. So the decision maker can use it and visualize all the infrastructure in their community. Basically, we'll focus on utility, transportation, communication, and building, because that's our core competencies in our team. So they will see which infrastructure may be outdated by a lot of factors, particularly their carbon emission as well, because that's not considered before. So now we take that into consideration. And then one is that we'll help them identify which infrastructure is needed to be modernized. And secondly, we will provide them with alternatives. These different alternatives will take into consideration the new technologies, such as which technologies can help those infrastructure be more energy efficient and reduce carbon emissions. Not only they're stronger to withstand stronger hurricane in the future. So that's for all these alternatives, our analytical model will give them like which one is more cost effectiveness in terms of both the return on the investment and also taking into consideration all these social and future benefits to this community. And the third thing we are doing is to create, so we said we co-create three things. The third thing we're doing is to build a community network. This community network will engage different stakeholders in the Panhandle area. So it will include the experts in different sectors and also community, like different local governments, and also the regional planners and communities. So this community network will help us co-develop our framework, technologies, give us feedback. So this will help us improve our platform and analytical framework. And they will also help us train the community leaders to use it and also disseminate it for the future use. So those are the three things we specifically are doing for our community.
With about 3 minutes left, let's go one more question. Heather, do you have one?
Sure, yeah. So this not being my field, this sounds really innovative, especially with the financial modeling of the net zero rebuilding plan to eliminate greenhouse gases. But I'm not sure about that. So around the world, are there other examples of projects like this that have done financially modeling of net zero rebuild approaches? And if not, I mean, so what gives this the novelty?
So I will give this question to our financial expert in our team.
Yeah, just don't ask for any stock tips. So specifically to your question, I can't speak to specific net zero based projects like this. However, we chose net zero as a framework, not necessarily because we think it represents the pinnacle of a regenerative society or everything that needs to be done in order to reach, net zero emissions and beyond. But we chose it because it is the North Star by which the Paris Accord is managing to global companies. It really has become a language that everybody is now speaking, and net zero by 2050 is something that we picked because it will allow the Panhandle region to mainstream into all these different programs that also come with additional opportunities for funding, additional opportunities for sharing expertise, and so on. Now specifically to the question about how do we model the financial impact of net zero, we're looking at an asset. So I know Munir asked about an example of like when Hurricane Michael has come through, how do we kind of assess or how do we guide on how that asset should be replaced? In many ways, it's too late by that point, right? We're actually trying to break that cycle of always being in this perpetual rebuilding. But once the assets are prioritized that need to be replaced, then we want to give guidance on, okay, how can you then replace those assets using net zero based alternative assets? So instead of rebuilt, like just a very quick example is the last coal-fired electricity plant in the Panhandle in Crist, Florida, in Escambia County, has now just been replaced by a natural gas fired electricity plant. It's not going to be feasible to then scoop in and say, okay, you know what, let's replace that now with solar or wind, because that's already a sunk cost. But for assets that are high emitting and have been chosen to be replaced, then alternatives can factor in net zero principles, either by kind of normalizing the returns based on their new emissions profile, which ultimately should go to zero by 2050, or we can tag it with the social cost of carbon, which is another concept that is gaining a lot of gravity, and explicitly model a social cost against the return that asset might provide the community.
And with that, that is time. Thank you so much, Infrastructure Resilience team. Next up is Wildfire Resilience.
Fires are among the most terrifying natural disasters. They are devastating to ecosystems, impact air and water quality, and wreak havoc on our health, communities, and economy. Florida's longleaf pine ecosystems are particularly vulnerable to wildfires. Hurricanes knock down trees and create an abundance of fuel, which combined with drought conditions lead to a tinderbox waiting to be ignited by lightning. While prescribed burns can mitigate these risks, they also have their own complex challenges. Most fire research looks at a single impact of an individual fire, and mostly in the western United States. Few have specifically examined the impacts of prescribed burns. In order to build a path to comprehensive forest fire resilience in the Southeast, we need to explore multiple impacts of the same fire. Our team will address this challenge by combining empirical and computational data and expertise from diverse backgrounds to form a novel framework that can be applied to any forest fire in any environment. Through a partnership with the Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee, we will catalog atmospheric and soil conditions both before and after a prescribed burn, and compare these observations with historic data and computational models. An epidemiological analysis will then estimate the burn's impact on public health. This comprehensive integrated approach combines multiple scientific disciplines and emphasizes Florida's unique ecosystem. By doing so, we can determine the optimal amount of fire that best serves the environment, economy, and people of Florida.
Please welcome to the stage Wildfire Resilience. Judges, questions. Who would like to go first? Elizabeth?
Sure. How do you foresee the results of this study impacting prescribed fire practices?
Impacting, sorry?
Prescribed fire practices.
Oh, prescribed fire practices. Yeah, so one of the big issues is that in order to properly manage a forest system, you need to have a knowledge of how hot do you want that fire to go and how long do you want that fire to last. So the fire duration and the temperature of the fire is something that you really have to control to mitigate any of the impacts on both the soil and on the atmosphere. So what we hope to understand more is what is the best fire conditions that will result in the quickest turnaround and rebound for the forest fire and for the ecosystem that it's impacting. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd also like to add to that a big focus of prescribed fire is that it's advocated by communities that do it. And the communities that are studying the impacts of those fires are oftentimes totally separate groups of people. So we know that the air pollution from prescribed fires causes health problems for people, particularly people who might have asthma or children. And so it's not clear from research that has been done what the optimal amount of prescribed fire is. We know that there are benefits and we know that there are costs, and nobody has yet put together what is the optimal amount of prescribed fire to maximize the benefits while minimizing the costs. And we've seen in the Western US that a century of fire suppression has had terribly bad consequences. So we know that the optimal amount of prescribed fire is more than zero. but we'd like to have a framework for understanding what the right number is, especially as the Western US is thinking about expanding the use of prescribed fire. The Southeast is really the place where you can look and see how prescribed fire is used widely, and probably the best place in the world to look at the costs and benefits together.
Thank you.
Laurel, question?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about how and whether you think what you learn would be applicable more broadly in the West and elsewhere in the world?
Well, our approach is to first try to do a great job in the Southeast US, and then to take the tools that we develop, the analytical tools, the analysis framework, and apply those to other regions of the world.
Okay, so that's my question. You're aiming to develop a tool that can sort of have different inputs that you've.
I think we view this as a multi-stage process. What we're proposing with the seed funding is to start on a small scale, pursue a larger grant, which would support a regional type analysis, and to develop this regional analysis with the mind of how can we make this general to other regions of the world.
Thank you.
Also, just to add to that, there's a lot of this research being done out west, as Chris mentioned. There's a big group of researchers looking at wildfire, but there's a very different ecosystem out west in the low and high deserts, the drought conditions, and all of that creates different metrics that are going to be impacting the fire that's being used. So the reason why we want to focus on the Southeast United States and in Florida in particular is because there is a gaping hole in the fire research and understanding what the impact is of the type of the fuel that we have here on the ground and the conditions in terms of the humidity and the atmosphere. So, that's kind of where we're going with this.
So I recall that some of the worst wildfires here were in the Okefenokee, and prescribed burning is usually done in places not like Okefenokee. It's done outside in state parks, perhaps. How is your study going to? Are you covering every type of forested terrain, or do you focus on specific environments, like you mentioned, the longleaf pines and tall timbers? How does what you learn at tall timbers then apply across the state?
That's actually one of the things that when we started early on trying to establish this project, I instantly started to think about the coastal dune lakes, which are extremely sensitive ecosystems where they're doing a lot of prescribed burning around them in the, along 30A and in the Panhandle. It's one of only 2 places in the world where that ecosystem exists. So, kind of having the ability to use tall timbers as our pilot study would then allow us to integrate with the DEP who manages those other sensitive ecosystems to try to repeat this and see how that changes when you have different salinity profiles of water that's infiltrating into the ground, as well as different atmospheric conditions like along the coast versus inland.
And I would say what a lot of these things have in common is that they're at the wildland-urban interface. The coast is, Okefenokee is really, the core of Okefenokee is really the exception, where it's entirely a wildland. But so much of Florida is at the wildland-urban interface in the Southeast US. So this is really a great place for looking at when you want to manage wildfire risk in areas with moderate population density. You're going to have these air pollution impacts. You're potentially going to have water quality impacts. And so that's what these places across the state have in common.
With about a minute and a half left here, I have a question from our Zoom judge, who I'm sorry is having difficulties and texted me her question. Similar to the other teams, who is your primary stakeholder and how do you intend to engage those stakeholders using the findings from your study?
So obviously we mentioned the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the Florida Fire Service. I have some connections that I've been working with collaborations out in Colorado with the U.S. Fire Service. So they would also be another stakeholder. I also think that, all of the different water quality impacts are going to be managed and mitigated by, the different localities and things like that. So in terms of the stakeholders on the ground, it'd be the Department of Environmental Protection, Florida Fish and Wildlife, of course, the state park system, and then the bigger scope, you can look to the U.S. Forest Service.
And also the Department of Defense. We have contacts there, and they do a tremendous amount of prescribed burning on the military facilities in the Panhandle and Southeast.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Everyone give a round of applause for the wildfire team, and let's bring up community resilience next.
Remember Hurricane Michael, the Category 5 hurricane that hit Tallahassee in 2018? In Tallahassee, destructive storms such as this occur every 10 to 15 years. However, in the Caribbean, at least 6 Category 5 hurricanes occur each year, impacting Caribbean communities economically, socially, and psychologically.
Disaster relief efforts often fail to focus on the psychological impact of these events. In my research on Caribbean families, they created artwork to convey their feelings of community when natural disasters occur. Drawings highlight the need to enhance community resilience.
Our team of multidisciplinary researchers at FSU plans to collaborate with relief groups and, most importantly, members of Caribbean communities. Our goal is to develop programs that will have a positive effect on community resilience when natural disasters occur. We will work closely with Caribbean communities to develop a culturally appropriate scale to examine the real impact of these efforts on resilience, a scale developed for the people, by the people.
As a result of our efforts, when disasters hit, community resilience can be accurately measured, thereby restoring hope and empowering Caribbean communities.
Please welcome to the stage community resilience. Judges, questions? Who would like to go first? Heather, please.
Yeah, I certainly understand the importance of developing a valid measure that has a lot of input from the communities affected. I'm thinking through to the next steps of the research and how the measure would be used, and I'm imagining some challenges to deployment, especially in a community that's just had a natural disaster. So what are your thoughts about the next step in terms of how this measure would actually be used on the ground and the feasibility of getting that information?
Part of trying to figure out how to move forward from natural disasters is to, first of all, identify what it is that the communities are missing. So after using the scale, sitting on the beach or wherever those community members are, then you're identifying what kinds of resources that are needed. So the scale is there to help ensure that the next steps are made. And so there are community leaders culturally who can speak for members, and there are also persons who are willing to participate, because the voice of one person is usually culturally seen as the voices of other members.
Thank you.
Just to add to that really quickly, Karina's dissertation really focused on Caribbean communities, and thankfully through her research, she has partnerships with community-based organizations. And so the scale for us is the first step in identifying the needs of the community, and then taking that to the organizations, the nonprofits in the area to actually deploy the resources that community members need.
Can I ask a question about language?
Our research is focusing only on English-speaking Caribbean countries. So in terms of the language, our endeavors is to ensure that we use language that is applicable to the members. So although here we're saying community resilience, a lot of the members in the Caribbean would say village resilience. So ensuring that we get feedback from members of the communities on what is appropriate, because although we are researchers, we don't want to impose those terms on the communities, but letting them be the voices for the types of language used even in the scale, but also beyond that.
Thank you for understanding both of my questions.
I'd like to go ahead and repeat the question from our Zoom judge from last time about stakeholder engagement and how you will use the findings from this study to put them into practice.
So one of the stakeholders that I already have contact with is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. And part of their endeavors is to ensure that we have sufficient data to know what are some of the things that are needed. So having those connections already is helpful. But we also would like to strengthen some of those connections with Regional Red Cross, as well as the University of the West Indies, who also has a resilience center. So some of those members and agencies who are on the ground, those are some of our own, as well as psychologists and other therapists who work in those communities.
I think I'd add my own question here. Could you talk a little bit about potential future funding for your project and where you plan to pursue said funding?
So we saw that there have been funding provided through the USAID. So we are looking at other ways of expanding those. But because most of it has to do with infrastructure, we want to look more at the psychological aspects, to looking at agencies such as USAID and Fargate as our sources of support.
Elizabeth or Munir, question?
I'm changing my question in my head, so I apologize if this does not come out as graceful as it should. With a tool like this, where you're trying to assess how people are resilient after disasters, is your plan to do the research in times of calm or be on the ground when something happens?
As this is a 12-month project, we do anticipate there may be natural disasters during that time. Although we focused here on hurricanes, but the Caribbean also has a lot of landslides, earthquakes, volcanoes. So we do anticipate there may be some instances where that is happening. So it would be helpful to also get those contextual responses, because that can help us to refine our scale.
Great, thank you.
The questions that you have in your questionnaire don't really focus. They don't really address how you would have responded to a specific incident, whether it is fear of Martinique or if it's hurricanes. There have been plenty of hurricanes through Maria, went through Puerto Rico recently enough that you could ask people directly about it. How do you then get at those questions?
So we're going to look at the psychometric properties of the scale as it is, and we've intentionally included the qualitative piece to ask culturally specific questions, also specific to disasters in the area to tweak the scale. And then, of course, once we have changed the scale based on the psychometric properties of the old scale and the qualitative interviews, we're going to then go back to the community and get their feedback to see whether or not we've kind of addressed what they thought they were communicating to us in the interviews.
With about a minute left, any closing thoughts from the team?
So this kind of extends off of Mike's question earlier. There's also funding, other funding sources at Florida State University that we will be pursuing. Obviously, this proposal was step one for us, and we're really excited for this. But regardless of the decision here today, our team plans on going forward and making this research happen. So we're really excited for what the future holds, hopefully through this opportunity, but we're also pursuing other sources of funding as well.
Thank you so much. And with that, we'll bring up our final team, individual resilience.
Have you ever gone through a period of your life when every day felt like a serious struggle? This empty, lethargic feeling is called languishing, a state of mental health lying somewhere on the spectrum between depression and flourishing.
Studies suggesting languishing is prevalent and negatively impacts productivity and quality of life. Yet languishing has been largely overlooked by behavioral and social scientists.
Life stressors such as the recent COVID-19 pandemic have triggered languishing for many people. Without intervention, these individuals risk significant declines over time.
We're already seeing an increase in major public health problems like burnout, depression, drug overdoses, and suicide. If we better understand what causes languishing, we can intervene early with effective treatments to prevent serious health problems.
Our team aims to establish a foundational behavioral science needed to reconfigure the spectrum of wellness to include languishing.
We can then develop interventions that promote resilience and recovery from stressful situations, with particular attention to critical periods of development that are sensitive to setbacks that lead to languishing.
Together, we will build a sustainable science of resilience to reduce languishing, improve quality of life, and advance public health.
Please welcome to the stage individual resilience. Judges, anyone want to go first? Heather.
Hello, I have a two-part question. I'm going to ask the second part first. Thinking ahead to languishing research, what are your thoughts on interventions? So you identify somebody who is languishing. What are your thoughts on where do you go with that as far as intervention?
So with interventions, we aim to find out about languishing through the first phase and then get a good definition of what's happening with languishing in this first phase, and then come up with some interventions based on what we find out that will help people to move from that languishing period to more of a flourishing. And like, for example, life stressors impact languishing and increase the probability of languishing and even depression. And so stress is also associated with resilience, with personal resilience. So we're hoping that these interventions will make an impact on these factors and move people toward a more healthy way of being and move them toward wellness, because all these things are related to health outcomes as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess going back to the first part, in my mind, I'm trying to kind of map this onto what we already know about the array of risk factors that lead to difficult functioning, anxiety, depression over time. And we know a fair amount about that: early childhood stress, history of mental illness, stress, as you were saying. So could you help me differentiate languishing from what we already know in terms of risk factors for challenge functioning over time?
I think they're very related, actually. The things that we know now often are correlations with particular outcomes over time. And we know that specific stressors can accelerate or lead to sort of a stagnant state of well-being. And one of the inspirations for this project was we showed that an Adam Grant article that came out in the New York Times this last year, and lots of people resonated with this experience of kind of feeling stuck, and that the pandemic had sort of initiated that. And the kind of stress that we see with the pandemic, I think, has accentuated and kind of given us some clues on some ways that often are kind of ongoing stressors. So these small everyday stressors that we're not responding to particularly well, not just sudden events. So when we look at sort of, if you were to look at sort of statistical models where you'd look at predictors of how well people recover from difficult experiences, those are factors that come into play. And we think of those as the resources that come along for the ride. But some people have resources, some people don't, and we know this from previous research. So what this would do would be simply intervening at a different stage of the process. We're trying to intervene earlier and be able to identify problems before people reach a more of a crisis state where a lot of the other interventions have been pointed. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
And one of the problems, just to add to that, one of the problems is that this group of people who are languishing, they're often overlooked because they're not at a crisis state to get where they need immediate intervention or, immediate crisis management through an emergency department or psychiatric unit. And so they're just kind of living at home, and it may be any of us really that may feel that we're just kind of going through the motions and we're not really moving forward as productively as we could. We could be on that spectrum of languishing.
I have a question here from our judge on Zoom. Since you were focusing on adults over the age of 50, does what happened to them developmentally before that age matter when it comes to languishing?
Yeah.
And how, I suppose?
So I'll briefly explain for those who haven't read our proposal that our initial phase, we plan to focus on older adults, those who are older, 50 and older. And that's for strategic reasons related to resources we have available at FSU and taking advantage of our opportunities and expertise, our shared expertise in that area. In the field of aging, we always take into consideration early life exposures and use that to better understand resilient responses or non-resilient responses to difficult events. So these things would be evaluated as well. We sort of imagine that there's a spectrum of resources and exposures that would set someone up to respond to different domains of languishing in different ways. For instance, people might be sort of languishing at work, and this might be related to a certain set of factors. They might be sort of languishing at home, in a relationship, in different domains of their life that would need to be targeted differently depending on their previous history, as well as what they have available. And as we know, people who come with, who face poverty over the life course, they may have experienced years of exposures to stressors and be more vulnerable to downward trajectories in all of these domains.
If I may, crystal clear, languishing is also something that happens to younger population. And we have plans to collect data, also using kind of student samples that are easily accessible here from FSU. So we crystal clear take that approach that you say, yeah, it's kind of a life course thing, but maybe it's not, I'm not expecting finding this in children, right? But emerging adulthoods up to kind of older age groups.
Last question, Munir, go ahead.
So you're developing a new concept of languishing. Do you have to get the metrics you need, et cetera, approved in the community before you can get a proposal funded? Or do you think that with this proposal, you will be able to advance this field far enough and get the concept sufficiently well accepted that you could do research, that you could get a fundable proposal on it in a year?
Do you plan to fund us? That's a good question. I think that with the current data, there are a couple of measures that are out there, but they haven't been validated in kind of the same kind of rigorous way that we think it needs to, especially in the way that we've conceived of it. So I don't think that at this stage we have what we need. It's a little bit early in the process of evaluating it, where we do need seed funding to be able to kind of manage the risk of exploring if we can measure it in a way that works, that fits in the model that we hypothesize exists, and also be able to identify clinical cutoffs to be able to say, okay, we can look at a range of symptoms, which is sort of what's happening now, but can we identify people who are languishing, who have particular needs? And that's not been done.
Thank you all. And since you are our last team, I will ask you to go ahead and please just return to your seats while I close out the program here. Thank you all. And how about one round of applause just for every team who participated tonight? Now, in a moment, I will ask our judges to please follow Grace in the back of the room there down to our judges' deliberation chambers. while they are discussing the proposals, we have a reception outside here for everyone else. But before everyone leaves, I just want to say how proud I am of all of these teams. You all, many of you attended the first Connector event. Many of you met your collaborators at that event. You did not know each other. And I went to your first meetings, and to see how far you have come from those first meetings is truly impressive. I am so excited by all of these projects, and while I wish we could fund all of them, we will have to choose one. But my commitment to you and the Office of Research Development's commitment to those 4 teams that are not funded is to help you find funding elsewhere anyway. So please feel free to engage us. We will be engaging you for sure to try to move these projects forward. So everyone, please enjoy the reception. We will be back in about 30 minutes. winner, I'd like to bring Dr. Laurel Fulkerson, Interim Vice President for Research, to the stage to give a couple of remarks.
Right here. Y'all hear me okay? I just wanted to take a minute or so to say on behalf of the judges how impressed we were with all that you have accomplished in not a very long span of time. Again, Evangeline said this earlier, but this is really just this semester, all this has happened, all of this has come together. Most of these teams did not know one another well, or at all before they began this process. So we were extraordinarily impressed with the diversity of proposals, of fields, departments, and participants. I think of them as 5 really stellar efforts, and I'm predicting great things for all of them, actually. In particular, I value their transdisciplinary nature and your work to sort of hit the sweet spot between dreaming really big and kind of making us convinced that you could pull it off. And I thought all 5 of you did a really nice job with that. And before I hand it over to someone else for a special announcement, I want to say my thanks to the judges for their time and expertise, to Mike and the rest of ORD for their hard work and creative thinking. Collaborative Collision 2.0 was their idea. I steal it. I pretend it's mine all the time, but it was actually their idea. They brought it to me, and I'm just delighted that it's come to life in such a powerful way. And I wanted to bring up Heather Flynn, who you heard at the beginning was not only chair of BSSM, but also chair of the CRC, the Council on Research and Creativity. And she has for you a breaking news announcement.
Good evening, everyone. I have the really fun pleasure of announcing a surprise award for the runner-up of our competition today in the amount of $25,000. We are awarding this to the Infrastructure Resilience Net Zero infrastructure. Congratulations, you guys.
Guys, come up on stage. Come on. Let's just come up on stage and get a quick picture here with, oh, Heather, wait, don't you. We want to thank you for your money with the picture.
Maybe I'll say where that picture is being taken, that these funds are being donated by the CRC. We convinced them, the executive committee, and then the regular full committee, that this was a risk that they should consider taking. They trusted us, so we're grateful to them as well.
So since I know this was a unexpected announcement and it's a smaller award, I will be in touch with all of you to work out the exact details of what that means. Budget-wise and scope of work-wise, so expect to hear from me soon. Thank you. Congratulations. So with that, I am very excited, and thank you, Laura, for giving me the opportunity to announce the winner. Before I do, I also want to say thank you to all of you for coming out tonight, to all of our judges for agreeing to be judges of this, and especially I want to thank the rest of ORD. Many of you know I have been out for the last 2 weeks with a personal family emergency, and without the rest of the office, Evangeline, Grace, Rachel, Beth, Carolyn, Mike Bosco there, thank you for the photography. This event would not have happened at all. And so it is an absolute credit to them, their work over the last 2 weeks that we are here this evening, and I owe them so much. Thank you guys so much. So with that, it is my pleasure to announce the winner of the first ever collaborative accelerator is the Fire Resilience team. Amy, come on up. Laurel.
We're going to start making puns any second now.
Oh, that's right. I forgot to make the burning question pun about fire. Hopefully this award lights a fire within your team to pursue external funding. All right, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. The drinks and hors d'oeuvres, is that what you're trying to tell me to do? Okay, there's more food, so please stick around for a little bit. And we hope to see you all again next semester for the next iteration of Collaborative Collision, focused on community research. So dates and times for those will be announced soon, and we hope to see you all again. Thanks.